My name is Stephen Cohen, and I am delighted to welcome back to the Mirror David Winton, who is our representative and the representative of the community in Jefferson City and has been doing that work since 1994. David, thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing your insights from Jefferson City.
Yeah, of course. Thank you all. It's good to talk to you. It's always nice to talk to people in a friendly environment. I spend a lot of my day in controversy, and several of you know, so it's just nice to talk to people actually that I don't feel like I have to put up my arms every time they throw something at me. So I thought we would visit a little bit about kind of where we are right now. We're 4 weeks into a session, or 3.5 weeks into a session. It's feels like it's longer than that. We have a brand new White House, brand new administration, which means everything is different now than it was the last time I think we visited. And so it's an incredible time, a lot of change, a lot of people nervous for a whole variety of reasons which is affecting policy and spending priorities. And so I thought, I'd talk a little bit about what's happening here in Jefferson City. Pretty hard to talk about that without talking a little bit about DC, but I'll do my best to be pretty prescriptive. And then, I'm really happy to take any questions y'all have, and we'll leave plenty of time to do that. And I'm happy to just answer as many questions as I can or get you answers around them. And so please don't hesitate to ask for that. So thank you all again. And I think we've got a couple of slides that we'll put up, and it'll help me stay on track. Thanks, Jude.
You're welcome.
That's great. So we probably can move forward from this slide. We've done that one, so that's good. I never did understand the idea of putting a title slide up when you're just going to ask somebody to move forward from it, but apparently that's what people do. So we convened in Jefferson City on January 6th. It's important to note the context in which this legislative session started. It's really unlike any legislative session we've had, and I've had about 28 of them thus far, so I feel fairly confident to say that. We started in the wake of a really significant national and state set of elections where we really didn't know what was going to happen. Remember, the changing of the guard, if you will, for the presidency was January 20th. We started here in Missouri on January 6th. There were lots of threats about what would happen in every state capital around the country, although many of us were wondering why anybody would come to Jefferson City for that. We thought we were remote enough where people just didn't want to travel. But it was a really interesting time. I can tell you that things are just different in our state capital. Security is tighter. People are more concerned. Folks are walking around and looking over their shoulders. What was a super congenial building, even when people didn't get along all the time, has turned into a building where people transact business and get out. And I will say, after having done this work for almost 30 years, that's a sad commentary on what that building has become. And hopefully we'll move past that here shortly. But in addition to this monumental change in governing, we also are in the midst of a pandemic, and that pandemic is not necessarily abated, although I think there's hope on the horizon, and we have the good fortune of working with Pfizer, so we get to hear all the really cool whiz-bang things that they're doing on this vaccine. And I can assure you that their counterparts at Moderna and AstraZeneca and other companies are doing very similar kinds of work. And it's, I will say, for Pfizer and Moderna, anybody who doubts the ingenuity of the American spirit just has to look at what happened on these vaccinations to see that in action. And I kind of brag on all of my clients, including the Jewish Federation. But in Pfizer's case, within 48 hours of having the genome sequencing for COVID-19, they had 20 candidates for vaccines that they believe very, very confidently would have an impact on giving immunity to the vaccine. I mean, that's just an amazing statement, 48 hours. And they were already in testing phases. So it's really a neat thing to see. So, every session is tough and every session is different. And when you lay on top of that the context of what is essentially a world crisis, and what I would argue to be probably one of the most difficult political crises our country has gone through since the civil rights movement, and maybe even including the civil rights movement. It's an amazing thing that our government continues to function and work, although a lot of people would argue our government doesn't function all that well, but it is moving forward. So, we can't talk about what's happening in the session without acknowledging the fact that all of these things are pressing down on Jefferson City like they are in Madison, Wisconsin, and every other state capital to really have an influence on what we end up with at the end of the session. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the major policies that Missouri is considering as they move through 2021. And we're probably just going to advance through 2 slides since we don't really need the next one because that's just a pretty picture of the Capitol. Issue number 1 is the COVID response. And it's actually not the top priority of the government by the Constitution. The top priority of our state legislature is to pass the budgets. It is actually, most people don't realize this, but it's actually the only thing the legislature is required to do as a part of the Constitution is pass the budget every year. But I think we can all agree that the most important thing that we have to do is respond to COVID. And like almost every other state, Missouri is seeing a decline in COVID cases, 20% from the 26th of January to the 2nd, which is a good movement, a good sign. It's not necessarily a trend, but it's positive. But I will tell you, we, like other states, are really struggling with our vaccine rollout. And we're struggling even harder with an equitable distribution plan of the vaccine. Part of it is because the vaccine is not necessarily in large supply. Part of it's because we don't have a really good plan. And I think, part of my job as a lobbyist, especially when I speak to groups, is just to try and call balls and strikes and not let my own personal opinions and biases get in the way of providing information. I think there's lots of people that will tell you what they think and give you their opinion. So what I'm going to try and do is either give you what I consider to be some level of experienced guess, or the observations that we have based on what we're doing and what we're seeing. And we're pretty engaged in this COVID conversation because we represent 2 very large hospital systems, including BJC. We represent Pfizer, which is obviously has a big chunk of this, and we represent rural health clinics. So we have healthcare providers at many different levels. We also have organizations that work very heavily in this space, including the Missouri Foundation for Health. So we get to see this from multiple vantage points. And, I'm sad to say that Missouri is probably one of the bottom states when it comes to our planning and what we have done. It's not because we don't have people that are not intelligent. It's not because we don't have resources. It's because we've just simply failed at doing a good job in terms of vaccine planning. Having said that, that's not going to stop the vaccine from rolling into Missouri and from being put into people's arms, and for really good, smart practitioners and vaccinators to do their job as we go through. We fully expect that this situation is going to get substantially better over the coming weeks. I heard from our Pfizer friends today that they expect a massive spike in vaccine accessibility by February 15th. So, and that has to do with production and all kinds of other things. But, we oftentimes will say money doesn't solve problems or something doesn't solve problems. In this case, more vaccines actually solve a lot of problems. And we're going to see those roll out. Unfortunately, to this point, it's been very chaotic. It hasn't been, there has been little consistency, and we're seeing entire communities not have any access to vaccine. And unfortunately, we're seeing some inequitable distribution of vaccines, not just from the standpoint of rural urban, but also in compromised and at-risk communities, especially within the low-income communities around the state and the African-American community. And so that is distressing right now, but I hope we are on a path to remedy some of that. We also have tremendous frustration, and the legislature is spending a tremendous amount of time being upset with the county executive of St. Louis County, as well as other jurisdictions that have imposed restrictions on businesses and on individuals and on religious worship and things of that nature to respond to the pandemic. I would characterize our response to the pandemic, the governor's response, as one that relies on local control. His position is, we're going to try and give the local government some tools, and they know best for what's in their community. This is not dissimilar to the philosophy about education and other things. The problem is he really didn't give very many tools. And when local governments actually took their own action, whether that was shutting down certain businesses or restricting them or anything else, there was a tremendous amount of criticism about what they were doing. And the one thing I think it's really interesting, there's a lot of criticism about our county executive, Sam Page, and I know people have feelings one way or the other, but I commented the other day to somebody that Sam actually issued his ordinance closing down businesses and extending that a week before he was standing for election. And so when you think about that, and by the way, that was not a done deal or a fait accompli. This was a real deal election where there was at least one other candidate that had a very good chance of winning that election. And Sam decided that it was important enough to do this, that he was willing to risk his election by doing it. And I will tell you, as somebody who's observed political life for a long time and legislators, that, in my opinion, is the definition of leadership and courage, whether you agree with his action or not. But the concept that he was willing to put that on the line to do that, I thought was a pretty remarkable thing. So again, I'm not suggesting to you that you should just think that was great what he did, but I am suggesting that the way he did it suggests that, that was a pretty bold move for him. The legislature is making strong consideration about in the future reining in the ability for local public health departments and communities to issue orders to deal with states of emergency. And although there are a large group of people, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, that believe COVID-19 is nothing more than a flu that's been politicized, I think, it seems to me the numbers would challenge that on any level. And the problem with making state statute to control the ability to respond to state emergencies is, what if it's the next time it's Ebola? Or what if it's the next time it's a flu that has a 20% mortality rate? And you've all of a sudden told local public health departments, by the way, you can't issue any orders restricting travel or restricting business transactions unless you get permission from the General Assembly. And that, by the way, could take 3 weeks to get. We've really put ourselves in a position, and that's something that I think legislators are beginning to understand as they work through this process. Kind of anger is turning into realization right now. And so we'll see where that comes out. But I can tell you, this is an unbelievably significant part of everything we talk about right now. And I think it will continue to be. In fact, this week we spent, how many hours? We spent 15 hours from 2 p.m. on Tuesday to 5 a.m. on Wednesday morning in the Senate, perfecting and finishing a bill to provide some level of COVID liability relief to businesses and to healthcare providers based on the kind of the unique context of the situation of what's going on. I expect us to have a few more sleepless nights here as we go forward. So any mistakes I make, any fumbling I do, is I'm going to just chalk up to having been up all night on Tuesday night and still recovering from that. So why don't we move to the next slide and talk a little bit about the Biden transition. So up until November 5th, there was nobody that really knew whether or not President Biden at the time, former Vice President Biden, was going to get elected. I mean, we talked about it, we saw the charts, and anybody that followed Nate Silver and all these people, but what us people in the political world who work here every day know is that, numbers tend to be reliable in predictable environments. And the problem that we had around believing polling and things like that is we knew we were in an environment that was unstable and unpredictable. We knew we could look around and see that things were just not the same. The amount of unrest, the social media traffic, the heightened level of scrutiny on everything that was happening just suggested that we just weren't in a normal place. And to believe the polling was really at your own peril. And so that was a highly challenged election. The Biden transition means a lot of changes. For those that supported President Trump, a new President Trump administration would have probably meant a lot of changes as well. But a Biden transition means something very different. Right now, we're seeing the new president focus hard on COVID, and to some extent, the quality of the COVID response in the first couple of months for the Biden administration is probably going to set the tone for his ability to do almost anything else as we move forward. And I think rightfully so. I mean, the Biden administration now owns this situation, and they're going to have to do something with it, and they have welcomed that. And so we have really what are 100 days for the Biden administration to get things on track, to get a sizable portion of the population vaccinated. It's not right now. We have a very small percentage of the population vaccinated. I would say that the administration, if they don't get a quarter of Americans vaccinated by the end of March, this is going to be a problem for them. And that's about 80 million Americans. So, that's kind of a tall order. And so I think they're working on it. The other thing that they're working on right now is a massive fiscal stimulus plan. The numbers, and many of you have seen them, are $1.9 trillion is the plan that they're working off of. The administration has signaled that they're willing to compromise on those numbers, and they're willing to talk through what that means. Now, so what do they, what does 1.9 trillion get you? I think it's always interesting. I work a lot in appropriations, and as a kid, I never thought I would be using the term billions in relation to the work that I did. I never aspired to be a bond trader or anything like that. So I work, with a B on a lot of things when I work on issues. And, now we're talking about a T. And the difference between a B and a T is a lot, it's 1,000 times. And so what do you buy for 1.9 trillion? And what does that mean? So 1.9 trillion buys you $1,400 stimulus checks to everybody making under like $75,000 a year. That rings in at about $300 and so billion. That $600 stimulus check that I hope many of you received, that price tag for the nation was $160 billion, just to give you context. We will likely see some additional resources flow into uninsurance compensation. We're going to see a boatload of money come into states for fiscal support. And what that really means is, and what states have been clamoring for, is a lot of states have taken massive hits on their general revenue collections because people can't spend money, businesses aren't open, taxes going down. And states, unlike the federal government, don't have the ability really to deficit spend. They have to balance their budget. And so if the resources go down by such a significant level, which of course a shutdown does, then what you're doing is you're bleeding that into the next fiscal year, where you're cutting massive chunks of education, massive chunks of healthcare, and you end up increasing unemployment. And the theory is, if you don't do something to intervene in the short term, that what you're doing is you're creating a long-term economic turmoil, which results in recessions, which results in depressions. And so the congressional action is actually very, very well based on economics. The only issue that people are concerned about, rightfully so, is the level of debt that we incur. For the state of Missouri, what this means is we are probably looking at getting a check from the federal government for something on the order of $3.5 billion to $4 billion. Just so you have a good context for what $3.5 or $4 billion means in a state like Missouri, which is roughly 2% of the population, that means that our entire general revenue collection in any given year, that means the tax dollars that you pay into general revenue, not the federal resources, is around $10 billion. So that means in one check, we're going to get 35% on top of what we would spend in general revenue on any given year. And that money can be used for anything. Right now, we are sitting on a $1.8 billion treasury balance. That's about $1.5 billion more than we would normal. So these numbers are just massive. In a state like Missouri that didn't have a massive amount of outlays, because it really didn't give a lot of money to local governments, to community agencies, it kind of sat on a lot of it. And we actually didn't have as bad of an economic downturn as we thought we would have. for a state like Missouri, COVID actually becomes a windfall situation where the state actually has the opportunity to do some really big things. My guess is that the governor's office will hold that money and they will use that money for a massive infrastructure plan. I fully expect a portion of the money that comes in to be used as our state match for a big infrastructure project to rebuild, for example, I-70 and do roads and bridges and all the things that we know have to be done and have been ignored for many years. So we further expect the Biden administration to come up with a huge infrastructure plan. He's talked about this. It's clear he wants to do this. And I would expect that thing to ring in at $1 trillion or so as well. So we can look at the Biden administration considering spending around $3 trillion. Most economists don't think it's a horrible idea to spend dollars like that, as long as you're putting them into something that is really stable, long-term, and good investment. But this will add a substantial chunk to our deficit, which I think is of grave concern to folks. We also know that with the new administration, they're going to change the way states are allowed to administer Medicaid. Under the Trump administration, states were experimenting with block grants on Medicaid, which is not always a positive thing, work requirements, differential benefit packages, all these other things. In a Biden administration, it's highly unlikely they will approve any kind of waiver that would potentially reduce the services that are being provided. Missouri is in a unique position because we voted in August to expand Medicaid, which means we will move from having about 1 million people on Medicaid in the state of Missouri. We'll add 275,000 people, give or take, to the system within the next 12 to 18 months. Those people are going to be comprised of 18 to 65-year-olds that make between 10 or 15% of the federal poverty level, which is about a couple of $1,000s a year, all the way up to 138% of the federal poverty level. This is a very, very large chunk of what I would call working poor. These are people that are going to work most days. They're probably working 40 hours a week. They're probably making between, $9 and $14 an hour. That's who's going to be in this category. And they will, for the first time, have access to kind of consistent healthcare, which will be a very interesting thing to see happen. And obviously our unemployment rate, our uninsurance rate will drop down dramatically over this. So that will actually happen in July. So with the changing of the Biden administration, the state will be a little limited on what it's allowed to do or not do in relation to that new population. There's also a lot of talk about, oh my gosh, a Democratic administration. And by the way, we go through this every time. And there's a whole big bunch of rhetorical tools that are used when Republicans take power. But, so of course, when a Democrat takes power, it's your guns are going to be taken away, the deficit's going to balloon, this kind of the rhetorical tools that people start ginning up in order to get ready for the next election cycle. And so one of them here is guns. And so we are going to see a backlash to that with all kinds of Second Amendment bills. In fact, today, our Missouri House, which is overwhelmingly Republican, passed what they're calling the Second Amendment Preservation Act. By the way, the Second Amendment doesn't need preservation because it is still in the Constitution and nobody's repealed it. So by definition, it has already been preserved. And in Missouri, the Second Amendment is alive and well, and people can carry guns pretty much wherever they want to. But again, this is a political statement. And so our legislature passed what is a blatantly unconstitutional bill to go beyond the federal Constitution and do all kinds of things about conflicts. But we're going to see lots and lots of those kinds of bills pop up as we move forward. I actually believe we're going to see state legislatures start passing resolutions about balancing the budget and all kinds of things, because most state legislatures are dominated by Republicans. We have the Democratic administration. And just so we're clear, I'm not giving you a partisan viewpoint. I'm just kind of giving you the overall observation of how these things work. And if it was the other side, we'd be doing something a little differently. So this administration at the federal level really does change so many things. And the other thing that happens is everything else changes. So we will have a whole new set of state's attorneys. We'll have a whole new set of administrators for every department in the United States bureaucracy. And we'll have an enormous sea change in terms of what you can and can't do. You're seeing now with executive orders, the Biden administration is basically rolling back a lot of the regulatory actions that the Trump administration took. So why don't we move to the next thing? So we talked about the Democrats in the executive branch. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening right now in the congressional wings and in the Republican and the Democratic parties. And I mean, I think we always talk about like there's this battle for the Republican Party or battle for the Democrats, and it's always this group versus this group. And most of the time, you know, there's some truth to that, but it's pretty clear who's winning and who's losing and all those things. We're actually in a massive place of uncertainty right now. I mean, we're starting to get some clues, but on a political level, it's very uncertain. And we really are, at this moment, at least I believe, we really are in a place where Republicans are trying to figure out, and they're not doing this quietly and through debate. I mean, they are trying to figure out who's in charge and who's going to be running the Republican Party. You know, you're hearing a lot of conversations about how Donald Trump is the de facto head of the Republican Party. I think there's some truth to that, but it's not clear. It's very interesting as we look at it. And by the way, this is happening on the Democrat side too, and I'll talk just a little bit about that. On the Republican side, we are already seeing this act out. So Liz Cheney, who is former Vice President Dick Cheney's daughter, she's a congresswoman from Wyoming, and she is in the leadership of the Republican caucus in the Congress. And she voted for the impeachment of President Trump, right? Not very popular if you're a Republican. And there's a congressman named Matt Gaetz from Northern Florida, who is a very pro-Trump congressman. And he decided to go up to Wyoming and make trouble for Liz Cheney and started a petition to recall her from her leadership position, meaning they wanted to vote her out of her leadership position. Well, that happened yesterday. I mean, she didn't get voted out, but they took a vote. And what was really interesting was, and Liz Cheney is a pretty tough congresswoman. She's kind of like her dad was. So what happened yesterday, apparently, was that Mr. Gaetz decided he didn't have the votes to oust her, and he decided to call off the vote to recall her on her leadership position in the Republican caucus. And she said, not so fast. Let's go ahead and have that vote anyway and just see where things stack out. And she won that vote by a margin of 75 to 25%. Now, what's really, really important about that is a closed ballot. So leadership elections by definition and rule in the Congress on the Republican side are closed ballot. So you don't get to know who I vote for leadership. However, election or decisions about throwing people out of the caucus are not closed ballots. So now we're about to have a censure or some action on a member of Congress that was just elected out of Georgia that is, I mean, a lunatic, right? I mean, conspiracy theory central, Representative Taylor, and that's going to be an open ballot. And everybody believes that she will be retained because it's an open ballot. So you can see internally what's happening. And, you know, a lot of people are going to call that political cowardice and all these things, and that's fine and probably pretty accurate and deserved. But the truth is, like, you can see people struggling internally, like, we really wish these people would go away, but we don't feel strong enough or secure enough to actually take them on externally. And I think, you know, if you talk to, this is when I talk to my friends on the Republican side, that's really what they were echoing over the last 3 years was, yeah, you know, we were really worried about the president. We're really worried, like, what's going on, and we're not crazy about it. But, you know, honestly, we're a little more concerned about saying anything too publicly about it. So the things that we saw were these two kind of leadership conversations, but we also saw the minority leader, who would have been the speaker, Kevin McCarthy, went down to Mar-a-Lago and he paid a kind of a photo op visit to former President Trump. And he's having a really rough time here. You know, he supported Liz Cheney, but by the same token, he's not willing to come out and call out some of these other folks out there. And so I think the Republican Party is having tremendous difficulty, and where this is really coming to a head, I believe, is there's going to be a lot of reporting now, and there's going to be a lot of internal examinations and investigations about what happened on January 6th. And when those things come out, there's going to clearly be members of the Congress who were part of those conversations. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist because I just don't believe people in government are nearly smart enough and nearly coordinated enough to pull off a conspiracy. But I do believe, there was this group of people that were really working in one direction. I think part of those people were members of Congress. And it's going to be very interesting once the Congress is confronted with that information, what they will do with their own folks and whether they will refer them out. Just so you know, this is the January 6th thing. I don't know whoever covers law enforcement on this call. This is the largest FBI investigation ever undertaken. This will be the most number of arrests ever done in a single event. By the time it's all said and done, it is unbelievable how many people are going to be going to jail for a super, super long time. The Democratic Party is doing the same thing, by the way. So we have clearly a battle in the Democratic Party, if you look at it, between the very liberal wing of the Democratic Party that we can represent by, AOC, and we have what I consider to be kind of the old guard moderate wing. It's clearly represented by Nancy Pelosi. Now, who would have ever thought 10 years ago that we would be talking about Nancy Pelosi as kind of a moderate Democrat? I mean, I can assure you I certainly didn't. But at the end of the day, when we talk about moderate Democrats right now, we're really talking about, and moderate Republicans, we're really talking about individuals. I think you could replace that with governing Democrats and Republicans. We're really talking about a group of people that want to govern from the middle and from the center versus a group of people that want to, really, really change the scope and mission of government. And I think that's exceptionally important. This is the first time in decades and decades, even Ronald Reagan didn't do this. This is a group of people that really want to throw out the basic concepts and agreed upon norms of what government will be or not be and go to some totally different direction. And on the left, that means, we can kind of go down the list, right? That means college tuition. And that may be great for everybody. That is a big, big change. And on the right, it means removing a lot of those things, right? Maybe not having safety nets, maybe not having certain things that we rely on today. And those are really important sea changes. But I think we have an administration right now who's now proving that, and especially with his appointments, I think, frankly, his Attorney General appointment with Merrick Garland should tell everybody what they need to know about the kind of appointments and the people he's going to put into place and all that good stuff. I mean, that's about as down the middle as you can get. But, we clearly have a president that's saying, listen, I know I've got a bunch of people on the left that are going to be mad at me. I know there's a bunch of people on the right, they're never going to like me, but here's what's going to happen. As long as I'm here, we're going to govern from the center. And I think that's what you're seeing right now, notwithstanding the Keystone Pipeline and a couple of other things. In Missouri, we're seeing that play out on tax, education reform, and Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion is a great example. Our governor actually put Medicaid expansion in his budget that he submitted to the General Assembly, not because he loves it, but because the people said they want it. He's going to put it in there. He's not going to fight. He's not going to play games with it, right? In the Senate, we're hearing the same thing because they're pretty well driven by what I would consider to be mostly moderate Republicans. And by the way, it's all on a spectrum. So when I say moderate Republican, I'm not necessarily saying centrists. I'm just saying moderate Republicans. Education reform is the same. Tax reform, we're having all these debates right now, and we're seeing this group of centrists, Republicans and Democrats, get together and say, yeah, we probably need a little more money to run the state of Missouri. So let's pass a Wayfair tax, an internet sales tax. Let's not give all that money back in taxes. Let's be thoughtful about how we do these things. And then you see the folks on the very far right that their position is we should just give back as much tax money as we humanly can to people, shrink government as much as we can, do as little as we can, and everybody will be better off. And then we have folks that are a little further to the left that feel like, we don't do nearly enough and we need to be kind of more to more people. And so those are the kinds of things that we're seeing, but we definitely are seeing these battles. Let's move on because I'm taking a lot more time than I should be. And I'm really not sure this matters a whole lot to you all. So I'll go very quickly through this. So the issues that we really expect to kind of exhaust the legislative session, of which we probably will be small because of COVID, the budget is a huge issue. That is the one thing they have to do. And that's happening now. Not only is the budget going to happen, but there's going to be all kinds of complicating budget bills that have to be filed and passed as the federal government appropriates additional dollars that come into the state that we didn't expect. Medicaid expansion that we've talked about, there isn't a lot to do. That is mostly an administrative function, but I can tell you they're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. Child welfare is the really big one. I think the governor has come out with a really big plan to do an Office of Early Childhood. And I will tell you, knowing this from the inside, this is not lip service. This will be a massive undertaking of moving all the child welfare programs, including daycare and all of these massive programs under one roof to coordinate and resource in a way that we essentially create this continuum from 0 to 5. And that's a really big deal. And I think the whole idea is the goal ultimately is the children are safe and healthy. And most importantly, on top of that, they're ready to go to school. When they hit kindergarten, those kids are ready to learn to read and to write and be ready to go. And this has been a dream for a lot of people for a long time. So I give this governor a tremendous amount of credit for being bold enough to say we're going to start that process and do it. I expect it to take a couple of years, but this is a really important first step. And then, all kinds of health and human service issues will go across the board. Right now, we're fortunate we're not in a position where the governor is going to have to trim budgets, and we're going to see further reductions in reimbursement for in-home services and all kinds of other things we do in the safety net, which shrinks the access to the safety net because many people can't do that work anymore. But we are pretty excited that we're seeing a lot of opportunity there. Most of it really relies on the fact that Missouri got a lot of federal money. And so the reduction that we saw in tax revenue was offset by the money that we saw. So we're going to skip through the next few slides because I covered them very quickly, from Medicaid expansion and child welfare. And there's all kinds of other little things that we're going to be doing this year. But I really want to stop and ask folks if they have questions that I can try and answer. I want to be respectful of your all's time. And I do apologize for going way over probably.
I'm not seeing many questions come up here. You can type into the chat if you wish, or raise your hand on the computer. I don't think we have many questions at this time. David?
I have a question for you, Judith.
Oh, yes.
Okay, with respect to Representative Green, is that a motion to be handled by the House of Representatives on a majority vote or a 2/3 vote?
Yeah, I am not an expert on the rules around expulsion, but the first thing that has to happen is the caucus itself has to make a decision about what they're going to do. So that's really the first thing. And then it would go to a House vote, and an ethics investigation would have to ensue, and then they'd have to say, yes, indeed, this happened. So there's a lot that has to happen. I believe an expulsion vote is a 2/3 vote. I know, for example, in Missouri, it is 2/3.
Bill Livingston has a question about what about reappointment? Reapportionment, I'm sorry.
Oh, reapportionment. So redistricting. So, every 10 years after the census, every state legislature has to get to work to reapportion their congressional districts. And then what flows from that is separate commissions. Every state does it a little differently. In Missouri, we have commissions that would then construct House and Senate districts. Now, many of you may remember Clean Missouri that passed a number of years ago, a couple of years ago, that would have left reapportionment or redistricting up to a demographer or professional. That was overturned on the last ballot. And so we go back to the old system, which is the legislature has committees in the House and the Senate that create congressional districts. We have 8 members of Congress, and they have to draw those lines in such a way where each congressperson represents roughly the same number of Missourians, and that there's all kinds of other requirements about the districts being contiguous, and you can't kind of do a block here and a block there. And then we have commissions that draw state house and state Senate lines. You can't do that until you know what your census is, because one of the primary issues that you contend with is making sure you have the right size population in each one of these districts, and that flows all the way down to state house districts that will have about 35,000 people in them versus congressional districts that'll have, I think they have about 800 or 850,000 people each. The problem is the census was a little messed up this year for a whole variety of reasons. And so the census data that we would normally have already gotten, say at the end of December, will not be available until April 30th. And so reapportionment will not occur until a special session that will happen probably in the summer or fall.
Harriet has a question. With the concerns of controlling the pandemic and the outreach to underserved people to get their vaccines, is there a plan for those who are unemployed and have no insurance getting their shots?
Yeah, so the federal government was really clear from the beginning, nobody would pay for a vaccine. So the vaccine is free of charge. You sign up for the vaccine, you go, try and sign up for the vaccine. Right now, it's pretty tough to do. And you will get an appointment, whether it's at CVS or your healthcare provider, whoever. If you have a doctor, my recommendation is reach out to your doctor's office and ask them what the best way is to get the vaccine. That's probably the smartest way to go. There's also going to be community events. I know in St. Louis County, I actually talked to Sam Page a little bit about this. I believe in St. Louis County, they will be trying to do community events when they get vaccine to do them. But you sign up, you get an appointment, you go in, you get your vaccine. They watch you for 15 minutes to make sure you don't have an adverse reaction, which most people are not having. And then you get to go home and you come back for Pfizer 3 weeks later, you get your second vaccine and you get that appointment. For Moderna, I think it's a 2-week or 4-week turnaround. And then you're done. There should be zero charge to you for a vaccine.
Louise has a question. I think this, would you explain Haley's, I think maybe she meant Holly's actions recently. Is this a change of his views?
Well, Senator Hawley's only been in public office for just a handful of years. He was the Attorney General for a year or so, and then he turned around and ran for the Senate. So I would be lying to you if I could articulate what Senator Hawley's views are. I don't know. He hasn't been in public office long enough for us to have a record to suggest, oh yes, this is a big departure. I can tell you what he says. I can tell you what most politicians say. I think Senator Hawley made a calculation. Somebody asked me if I could explain some of this. I think Senator Hawley made a basic calculation that he was going to be the inheritor of the Republican Party that Donald Trump built or changed. And in doing so, his thought process, or not thought process, I think his calculus was that he could be Donald Trump without being Donald Trump, meaning he could have those populist kinds of policies. I mean, if you strip away all of the rhetoric and all of the banter around Donald Trump, and you try to say, what's that political philosophy look like? And I don't want you to confuse that with me suggesting that he had a political philosophy, but I think we can ascribe a certain basic political philosophy. I would call it populist. I would say that, it was much more about appealing to the larger group of people, to say, hey, I care about you, the little guy, right? And so whether it's on information security, so look at Senator Hawley's behaviors around Facebook and Twitter. And so you're seeing him he was doing this 6 months ago saying, I don't like this. I don't I don't like what you guys are doing. I think it's a monopoly. I think it's wrong. I think we should be protecting people's information, right? I mean, really espousing a very populist viewpoint about whether or not a company has gotten too big to be a company that we need in the United States. And so I would say that he was viewing himself as a populist candidate for the 2024 election. I think that was his calculation, and that he was going to be kind of a nicer version of that. I think where that calculation, actually, he performed it really well until really until January 6th. You know, it almost could have gotten away with it for a little while if he had just stopped. You know, once the Capitol got broken into, if he had just kind of taken a step back and said, hey, probably we ought not do this. You know, let's go ahead and just confirm the president. We know how this is all going to end. Let's just get it done and go forward. He'd probably be okay. That picture that he has that shows him raising his fist to a group of protesters, you know, in politics, you can see certain things if you've done this long enough, and you can pinpoint those and say, that's something that will haunt him for the rest of his political career. That picture will be on his problem list for as long as he does anything. I would suggest to you that nothing will happen to him in the Senate. He won't be censured. Nothing will happen. That's my guess. And I would also suggest it is highly likely that Senator Hawley can be a U.S. Senator from the state of Missouri for as long as he would like to be. What I can also tell you is that there is no chance at this point that he will be a Supreme Court judge or anything higher than what he is right now. Where does Senator Blunt stand on this is the second half of the question. I don't know. I haven't asked him. My guess is, knowing him pretty well, that he's not overly, I don't think he's impressed by what happened there. And I know Senator Blunt well enough to know that he cares a lot about his constituents, whether you like his policies or not. And that's not something he would ever do. Now, you know, coming out against your colleagues, again, it's a political courage kind of question. And I think you can draw whatever conclusions you want to about what people do or do not say, you know, about their colleagues or calling them out. But no, I don't think Senator Blunt condones that action in any way, shape, or form.
And John asks, with the propensity of the Missouri legislature of adjusting the will of the people, do you think they will figure out a way to shrink the Medicare expansion amendment?
Yeah, so so it's real hard to do because the drafters of the Medicaid expansion amendment just did a really good job. They made it as simple as they could, as clear as they could, and they put it in the Constitution. I do think that our friends in the Missouri House will look for opportunities to make expansion difficult. The problem that they have a couple of problems fundamentally to making any significant progress on this. The first problem they have is that the governor's office has already signaled we're doing this, and the state Senate has basically signaled we're fine, which means they're alone. It's really hard to be alone and do anything significant. The second problem they have is that they have almost no control over how the program is actually implemented, because the State Department of Social Services in the Mo-Health-Net division, they're the ones that are drafting all the state plan amendments. They're the ones that are going to the federal government and saying, here's what we want to do. You know, so one of the big tests is the federal government under Medicaid expansion says, you have to design a benefit plan, meaning what services somebody on this program can get. And it does not have to be the same benefit plan as you have for all the other Medicaid plans, meaning you can scale it back. You can reduce the number of benefits. And this was a really early test for the administration to decide what kind of plan they were going to design for these individuals. And the administration decided that it was not only better for individuals, but also easier to administer if that benefit plan was the same wide, robust Medicaid plan that we have currently for every other enrollee. That would have been a place where you could have really done some damage to the expansion amendment. And so the legislature doesn't really have control over that. The only thing they have control over are the purse strings. And the truth is, Medicaid is the kind of program that's by law that the second a dollar is sitting in that program, it doesn't matter. It's an entitlement program in our state. And there's a lot of details in that, but what I would say to you is If the governor put in $10 into Medicaid expansion and it cost $1 billion, we would still do the program and we would fund it in the supplement. And if he didn't put any money in, it would take us an extra 6 months to get a Supreme Court ruling. But I would guess the Supreme Court would say there's no real choice here. So, I mean, I think, yes, they will try and tinker with it. And I can only imagine what my friends over there are cooking up, but I don't expect that they will be successful in anything.
Harriet would like some so she's I understanding everyone will be having shots available. Unemployed people without insurance, even if one is not in the age category or with pre-existing morbidities, they still need to register by going to their doctor and inquiring.
I
This
don't.
is
Is that so? Let me
it's
just
a
try on this.
continuation, I think, of her previous
Sure,
question.
sure. So my recommendation to call your doctor is because I just think that's an easy point of access to the healthcare system. I think you could also, there's an online map that the state of Missouri has created to show where vaccinators are. And I think you're free to call any of those. If hospitals hold mass vaccination sites, they will likely put up some kind of a website or portal where you can register and try and get an appointment for it. So there should be multiple ways to do it. Right now, we just don't really have very many vaccines in the state, but I expect over the next 2 weeks for that to change a lot. And no, I don't think it matters whether you are in class tier 1, class tier 2, whatever. When it's your turn to get the shot and it's available, you can sign up, you can get your appointment, you can get the shot free of charge, and then get your second dose. That should not be a problem. So for anybody, there should be no charge. I can walk in and get my shot. I probably won't be able to get a shot for 3 more months, although I already had COVID. But when I do, there won't be a charge for me.
Okay. Sue is asking, in the redistricting, do you feel they will count all residents or just those registered to vote? Everyone is living and using resources provided by the state, so shouldn't all count.
Yeah. First of all, hi Sue. It's good to see you, and we miss you in Jeff City. I hope you're well. I think that the law is pretty clear about this, and there was a lot of conversation in Clean Missouri about this, whether we're counting people who are undocumented or not, and it really actually doesn't matter. The census is what really drives this conversation. And so when we redistrict on maps, it's going to be all citizens it'll be all residents in that community are counted. The real question is, did we get them all counted? I mean, that's always the problem in the census is, this is why there's such a massive push at the state level, because federal resources that come to our state, and COVID is the great example. We're basically 2% of the population. And so if we undercount and we show ourselves as fewer than 2% of the population, what that really means is we are going to dock our own budget by whatever that number is from when the feds send money down. Right now, the calculation is if the federal government says we're going to send $100 billion to the states for relief, we take 2% of that, and that's going to be darn close to what we're going to get. So that's really important. So I think, Sue, redistricting will count virtually everybody that was counted in the census.
David.
So looks like there's a question from Mary. Voting law changes or remain? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I got you. So do I think we'll have more voting law changes that may place additional requirements or restrictions on voting, I think is your question. We have a pretty onerous system as it is, so I'm not sure we will see additional changes. I mean, I live in this world, and I can tell you we change in both sides. We change the rules around who can vote, not who can vote, but how difficult it is to vote based on who we want to get elected as a general rule by party. And as a general rule, although I will say, I'm not sure if we look at the last 2 elections, this is going to bear out anymore. Fewer people means Republicans do better. More people means Democrats do better. Again, I'm really not sure that's going to bear out all that well, because we had one of the largest voting percentages in the nation's history in the last 2 major election cycles. And, frankly, Republicans did awfully well. And so there's a whole bunch of political science behind that, probably, including things like, well, traditional Democrats voted for, Donald Trump. But they also voted down ticket Republicans. So it's not just a phenomena about whether they voted for one individual. They proved to vote down ticket. The Senate did exceptionally well on the Republican side in this past election cycle. And frankly, House Republicans did really well, way better than what was anticipated. And those really are, it's about as close to local elections as you get at the federal level.
David, may I ask you, yesterday I was listening to reports from South Dakota where the legislature is working to reduce the rights of transgender people.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you anticipate something similar in Missouri.
Yeah, well, there is always those conversations, especially in red states. And there's a lot of people just don't understand. I remember like 20 years ago when I started working on mental health issues, and you see Carol Simon up there. And I remember the lobbying when it came to working on mental health and behavioral health was spending a lot of time explaining to people that behavioral health and physical health really weren't different. They were really, two peas in a pod. And if you just move, 1 centimeter in the brain, you go from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's, or whatever, like I'm pretty bad at that. So I'm not exactly sure that was correct, but you get the gist. And I think a lot of this is people just don't understand. I have friends on both sides of the aisle, and I talk a lot to folks on the Republican side. That's primarily who's in the legislature. So I'd be awfully lonely if I didn't. And what I get more than anything else is just this general, I just don't get it. I don't understand why that happens. And I think what you're really going to see, Stephen, is not a response to whether or not that's real or not real. What you're seeing is a response to extremism. And I think that's an important distinction. And like, I'm going to violate my rule of trying not to say controversial things, at least meaningfully not controversial. And, I will say there's a lot of extremism on both sides of the aisle. And I think what you see from the left oftentimes is a response to extreme actions on the right, like gun policy, frankly. And what you see or abortion policy. And what you see on the right is oftentimes a reaction to extreme policy on the left. There is this thing in Missouri, there's this legislation that says that you can't put your kids on treatment, on hormone treatment that's essentially transitioning gender when your child is under the age of 13. And then somebody would ask, well, who would, what kind of parent would do that with an 8-year-old child? And people just don't understand that. It feels extreme. And so there is this need to do something. And I think that's what you're seeing. So yeah, I think we will see some of those bills move along the continuum. I don't know that many of them will pass, but those will be the kinds of things that you see. I don't think it'll be an issue about denying them rights necessarily, or denying people that identify as transgender the right to, go in and shop in a store and things like that. We have our share with Senate Bill 2039, but my personal commentary, which again violates my rule, is, if folks on both sides would be willing to say, we're not going to do the things that are on the outer fringes, and we're all going to kind of repudiate that stuff. I think what you would find is the people that don't understand that and are scared of it, they're not scared of it anymore because they don't think it's going to happen. The one interesting thing that I'll leave with in this election, and this, again, since I'm violating my rules and giving you my own commentary, is people are asking the question really hard, what happened in the election cycle? How did Republicans do so well? And here's what I believe happened. I believe the vast majority of people woke up in the morning and they said, we think the left is going to turn this country into a socialist country. And the people on the left we think there's a chance the people on the right are going to turn this country into an authoritarian country if they get in office. And I believe that the people that were slightly on the left that felt that way, they felt like that they believed the institutions of our government would not allow that. And so they could actually vote for people a little bit farther on the right knowing that the guardrails that were in place based on our institutional history and our Constitution wouldn't allow that. And the people on the left, the right, absolutely don't believe that about our institutions. The people on the right said that is a real threat. And even if I have to vote for these bozos over here, and I'm not using bozo in reference to any specific person, I'll do that. Because if these folks get elected, I know what I'm going to get. And I think that's a really powerful statement. And it's a statement about fear, not about belief or discrimination or anything else. It's a statement about people are just afraid that that's the direction. And so I think that's a really interesting lesson. And when we talk about the battle for the Democrat Party, I'm going to tell you right now, that's the battle. And if you listen to the Democrats from Michigan and other more conservative states, that's exactly what you will hear them say. Is that is if they get if the far left of the Democratic Party wins that battle, then Michigan Democrats become extinct, and they really and I think they're right, because I've seen that happen in Missouri. So I think it's an interesting thing. Of course, that wasn't the question you asked, but I thought I'd just say that anyway.
Thank you. And David, thank you as always for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Most happy to do it.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful program, and we appreciate your time.
You bet. My pleasure. Be well.
Bye, everyone.